Well, thank you very much. It's a real honor and privilege to introduce Paul, who's been my friend and mentor since I started at RFF in 1980. And Paul was basically there the entire time since from then on until he left to be dean of the Eller School of Management at the University of Arizona. And it was a great loss for RFF and a gain for Arizona, but Paul is still in the game, as you can see, as he's here today. And there was a lot of remarks I could have made about Paul, but Paul, if you know Paul at all, you know that he does not like praise. And so I'm not going to lay it on at all. I just have to say just a couple of things so you just know a little bit about what he's done. At RFF, Paul was the embodiment of what this institution stands for, which is using academic-level research in the service of policy. And Paul lived that every day of his professional life in terms of hiring policies and in terms of the topics that we took, and in terms of his respect for the researcher. So it's really been wonderful to work with him, and it's one reason why turnover at RFF has been so low over the years. Those of you that know, all of us old guys still hanging around. Paul is mainly the reason for that. And he's done, his work spans the range of epidemiology, cost-benefit analysis techniques, path-breaking work with Maureen on the discount rate, and contributions in about every major EPA regulatory area, most notably Clean Air Act and Superfund work. And Paul's kind of dragged me along on all these things, too, and I find when I look over Paul's resume and interest, a lot of those are the same as for me. A couple of highlights, I think, is when he chaired the National Academy of Science Committee on the CAFE standard, where that committee recommended both that we could have higher standards, better fuel economy, but that the standards themselves needed to be reformed. And another highlight was when he was part of the Nobel laureate studied committee that NOAA put together after the Exxon Valdez oil spill to come up with protocols for doing stated preference studies. And again, as that's a major part of my agenda, these rules, these protocols have been something that I've lived by. Paul's also the champion of what up to now is lost causes. He championed the idea of creating a Bureau of Environmental Statistics. We're still waiting for that one. And at every occasion, Paul would push for a gasoline tax. So we're still waiting for that one. Just on a personal side, I wanted to just mention that, as you know, Paul is always clear, funny, sarcastic, insightful, and for these reasons, a darling of the media and a darling of conferences here. And it's, in fact, I would say of all of his skills, his communications abilities are his comparative advantage. And another comparative advantage is his, in fact, absolute advantage for sure, is his skills as an athlete. And I just want to tell you something you may not know about Paul. He used to be a great, I don't know if you still are, a great tennis player and golfer, but he's also great on the baseball field. And in fact, Paul got an offer out of college, I think, to play in the minor leagues, but turned it down. He preferred nerds to jocks. So that's really saying something. So I think I've gone on long enough, Paul. You probably hate me already. Yeah. Well, I had to stall because we don't start again until 2. So Paul Portney, let's give him a hand.
Well, Alan, thank you very much. As I heard him go on, I began to think I must have died or something, but no, I'm alive and reasonably well, and very grateful to be here. My thanks to the Society for Risk Analysis and to Resources for the Future for organizing this conference, and thank heavens for renewed interest in the role of ideas in government in general and regulation in particular. It's so nice to be back here and hearing things like this being discussed. Let me say a few words about how I came to be your lunchtime speaker today. I got a call 6 or so weeks ago from Phil Sharp, my successor at Resources for the Future. And I should say, Alan talked about what a big loss it's been that I left 4 years ago. Fundraising at RFF up sharply, staff size up, key people now highly positioned in government. I love this organization. I should have left 10 years ago. Anyway, so my successor, Phil Sharp, called me, and we sort of made small talk for a bit, and then he said, Paul, I've got a question for you. And I said, well, sure, Phil, anything. He said, what do you think about the First Amendment? And I was very surprised by this. I thought, well, with the nomination of Judge Sotomayor to the Supreme Court, maybe RFF focusing more on legal issues. So I said, well, gee, Phil, I'm a huge supporter of the First Amendment, a big believer in free speech. And he said, well, I was hoping you'd say that because on June 23rd, I'd like you to come to RFF. And give a free speech. Now, fairness compels me to say that because of the lustiness of the registration for this, it's no longer a free speech, for which I'm grateful. But RFF knows they'll get this back in a contribution in another couple of weeks, and I'm serious about that. So I'm very honored to be included. Once again, nice to be back among people who work on environmental issues related to benefit cost analysis, and it's really an honor for me to have the chance to talk to you at lunch, and I promise I'll be as brief as I can. It's a big challenge, of course, because you're checking your BlackBerries and mostly thinking about how you're going to keep mayonnaise off your pants and skirts, and I realize that. I'm going to try to be somewhat substantive, but also appropriately light for a luncheon talk. No footnotes or anything like that, I promise you. The subject that I chose for myself is cost-benefit analysis and common sense, friends or foes. And I will argue both sides of the issue as a practiced benefit cost analyst. I want to say that my thoughts about this actually go back 5 or 6 years to discussions that I've had here at RFF with Winston Harrington and Alan Krupnick, and particularly with Ian Perry. And goes back actually farther than that to the little paper that I wrote 17 years ago that I didn't think a thing of, but which has been mentioned several times, Trouble in Happyville. Someone told me after I explained how that paper came to be written that I ought to explain it to you. At the time, I was the editor of the Insights section of the Journal of Policy Analysis and Management. It's a section of the journal where there are very short papers, which get refereed like the longer papers, but the idea is that because they're shorter, there's actually a chance that more than 10 or 11 people would read them. And so the next issue of the journal was due. Several people had promised me insights, short papers. They'd been refereed. Maybe some of you are the authors of those papers, but you let me down. You called at the last minute and said, no, it's not going to be ready. And so I had to fill a little hole in the insights section of JPAM. And because I'd had this idea that was percolating, remember this is 1992, we'd had the NOAA panel on contingent valuation, a lot of controversy about that subject, and I had sort of been thinking about individual preferences and how seriously we take them, and had this idea of Happyville percolating around in my head, and so I wrote it down. I actually sent it off to 2 referees and said, I need to know if this is acceptable in a week. Fortunately, my mom and dad both thought it was publishable, and so we published. The editor agreed to publish the paper. I feel like I've let all of you and anyone else who's read this paper down in the sense that I said that I encourage people to send their responses to me. And apart from Maureen Cropper, who's always responsible on everything, and a couple of other people at Resources for the Future, I didn't hear from that many people, although a couple of years later, Roger Knoll at Stanford sent me 60 final exam answers to the Happyville, not to grade. He'd already graded them, but So I never got as many responses as I thought I needed to sort of write a follow-up to that. So I have been thinking about benefit cost analysis and when we take it seriously and when we have to use our BS detectors, and that's what I want to talk about. So let me start first of all by saying just a few words about benefit cost analysis as common sense. Because like many of you in this room, I've taught benefit cost analysis at Public Policy School at Berkeley and at Princeton, and we'll be teaching a little bit of it this year at the University of Arizona in the Economics Department in the Business School. And one of the first things I try to say to students to motivate them to care about benefit cost analysis is that you can think about this as an institutionalized version of common sense. You have a decision to make, and the way you will probably make this decision, I would go farther myself and say should make this decision, is to try to identify, whether qualitatively or quantitatively, the pros and cons associated with the decision, and then try to weigh, however you can, the competing merits and make the decision that on balance is best for you. Guys, this is what benefit cost analysis is. Now, we can do this, we can use as the denominator dollars, which we typically have done, because generally the costs associated with regulatory programs are expressed, or most of the costs are expressed in dollars. So we have labored to express the benefits in dollar terms, but we could measure them in pears, roses, salt, or any other kind of denominator. So keep that in mind. And as I say to my students, you would use at least a qualitative benefit cost analysis to make a decision about whether or not to pursue an MBA, to take a new job in St. Louis, or if you're a woman, to marry your fiancé, John. And I should alert you that all of my young students at the University of Arizona tell me that if you're a woman and your name is Kate, don't marry John. I don't know who either of these people are, but they're very emphatic about that. So at any rate, benefit cost analysis, as I see it, is the governmental and even personal embodiment of common sense in decision making. Here are the pros, here are the cons, here are the weights that I attach to these. Some I can express in dollars, some I can't. On the whole, I'm going to do this. That tells me then the benefits outweigh the costs of that particular decision. And I want to say one other thing, because this is, over the last decade or so, there are more attacks on benefit cost analysis claiming that it is unethical. And I have to tell you that I think that that's just a bunch of baloney. We have a deficit of $1.8 trillion per year, or at least for this year, in the United States. If that's not an indicator that resources are scarce, that we don't have more wants than we have money to address them, I don't know what more clear signal we could have. And when resources are scarce, not only is it not unethical to do benefit cost analysis, it would be unethical not to think systematically about using the resources that we have for the greatest possible good. Now, how you go about measuring that is a fair question. After listening to all of the discussions this morning, I'm glad to see how the big theoretical and applied problems in benefit cost analysis have all been solved in the 4 years that I've been gone from Washington. But I want to state emphatically that no one should ever teach benefit cost analysis to students or anyone else feeling apologetically about it and that they might be pushing some kind of unethical approach upon them. To me, it embodies ethics to figure out how we use resources carefully. So on the one hand, let me answer my question, benefit cost analysis and common sense, friends or foes. In that sense, benefit cost analysis is a friend of common sense, as I've tried to argue, almost the embodiment of common sense. But there are respects in which benefit cost analysis on an idiosyncratic basis that varies from individual to individual can sometimes make us queasy. And so I'm going to use two examples where benefit cost analysis leaves me thinking, I really am not so comfortable with this. Again, I emphasize that they're idiosyncratic. Let me use one example where I think that benefit cost analysis, based on how I feel, seems to undervalue an environmental issue. And this has to do with the shadow price we put on the consumption of a gallon of gasoline for reasons related to climate change and oil import security. Alan mentioned that I chaired a National Academy of Sciences committee and that reported in 2002 on fuel economy standards. And one of the things that we did then was to try to review all of the evidence on the shadow price of a ton of CO2 combusted, or a gallon of gasoline combusted because of CO2 emissions, and also the possible oil import externality, if in fact it's an externality, and the value that ought to be attached to that. And holding our noses and looking for the biggest possible estimates of the oil import premium and also the CO2 externality that we could find and that we thought we could plausibly defend, we said that combined, 25 cents a gallon is about the only additional tax on gasoline that we could justify to internalize the climate damages and the oil import consequences associated with oil consumption. Much more recently, in 2007, Ian Perry, Margaret Walls, and Winston Harrington published a terrific paper in the Journal of Economic Literature summarizing all of the studies that had been done by the time the National Academy reported, and then several recent studies that have been included since that time. And using their best judgment, and they would be careful to say that judgment is involved, they came up with a combined effect for both CO2 and oil import effects of 18 cents a gallon, below the value that the National Academy had used. They said that you could justify about a 6 cent per gallon externality tax for climate damage and a 12 cent per gallon externality tax for oil import dependence. Well, whether it's 18 cents or 25 cents, I have to tell you, it just seems too low to me. And I just wonder how many of you out there feel the same way. I take the risks associated with potential climate change seriously. And although this may be heresy to say here, I almost worry more about oil import dependence than I do about climate change. The United States is spending about $300 billion a year to import petroleum. From Venezuela, from Canada and Mexico, of course, but from Venezuela, from the Middle East, from Africa in particularly unstable regions. And to say that if we just increase the federal excise tax on gasoline by 18 cents, we don't have to worry anymore about the climate change consequences of gasoline combustion and oil import dependence, it just doesn't seem right to me. Now, that's not particularly scientific, but when we do benefit cost analysis, I think one of the things that we all have to do is occasionally ask ourselves, how comfortable am I with that? Now, I don't know what the right number is, and it's certainly the case that if you use the climate damages from, say, the Stern report, which I think is you'd have a big burden of proof to establish if that was what we were going to use, then you could get up to a gasoline externality tax for climate change of 60 or maybe 70 cents per gallon. But I think that Ian and Margaret and Winston looked pretty carefully at all these studies before concluding that about 18 cents per gallon did it for climate change and oil import dependence. Now, I want to give you another example, in this case where benefit cost analysis, and in this case the scientific part of benefit cost analysis, the part done by epidemiologists, makes me nervous, but the effect is in the opposite direction. And this has to do with the effects of fine particles on annual mortality rates. Many of you know these studies better than I do. A long, long time ago, I spent 2 or 3 years here at Resources for the Future doing epidemiological analysis. Someone at EPA told me that wasn't the right term. You're supposed to say that you committed epidemiology, not did it. At any rate, I was committing epidemiology at the time. So I've tried to pay attention to these studies since then, and I know that with respect to fine particle mortality studies done by Arden Pope and Joel Schwartz and others have become sort of the definitive studies that are used in air pollution epidemiology. But they're consider the following, and here I owe both Alan Krupnick and Maureen Cropper some thanks for helping me understand this and stay up to date, though I think both would disagree with my conclusion. About a 5 to 7% reduction in ambient concentrations of fine particles, 5 to 7% across the United States, is predicted using the dose response functions that are used for most of EPA's benefit cost analysis to predict 12 to 15,000 fewer deaths per year. So if we were to go from 20 micrograms per cubic meter to 19, or from 15 to 14, according to the epidemiological studies that we use, we're to believe that there will be 12,000 to 15,000 fewer deaths. I just don't believe that. It just seems way too high to me. And if we had the luxury of doing a controlled long-term study, which is very, very difficult to do, even short-term studies are difficult to do, to get people to inhale non-lethal doses of air pollution for short periods of time, unless you're fortunate enough to have graduate students, as I do. But to get people to breathe slightly higher concentrations of fine particles over a 40 or 50-year period, that's a very challenging controlled study to do. But I just have to believe in the depths of my heart that if we did such a study and reduced ambient concentrations of fine particles by 1 microgram per cubic meter, when ambient concentrations in most places are 15, maybe 16, 17, I just don't think we'll see 12,000 fewer deaths. I just don't believe it. Now, there's a burden of proof on somebody who says that, first of all, to say, well, what's wrong with the study? And I will cheerfully confess that I've looked at the study. I've tried to read it carefully, the most recent one recently. I don't see any obvious covariate, any variable that's left out that probably varies with ambient concentrations of fine particles and thus accounts for the effect that's attributed to fine particles. But I just find that hard to believe. So I guess in this case, I see benefit cost analysis, or constituent parts of it, as in my mind at least, conflicting to some extent with what seems to be common sense. So, having talked about how benefit cost analysis can both be the embodiment of common sense and can, at least at some times, in some of its constituent parts apparently conflict with common sense, I guess I owe it to you to say what I would do. And what I would do is use the best research that we have available when doing regulatory analysis. So when someone says to me today, what air pollutants should I worry about, which I occasionally still get asked, I say, based on the existing evidence, you ought to be most concerned about fine particles in the air, because the statistical evidence that exists today, and which seems to be given the most weight in EPA analysis, suggests that the elasticity of fine particle concentrations, or the mortality elasticity with respect to fine particle concentrations, is significant enough that we have to pay attention to this. And I believe that we ought to worry less about ambient concentrations of ozone, because I think their effects on both acute and chronic mortality are small, and I'm skeptical about the effects on premature morbidity. So even though this makes me nervous, I use the best evidence that I can, in the same way I would when trying to determine the externality value to attach to one less barrel of oil consumed. As a regulatory decision maker or an analyst providing information to him or her, I don't think I would have any choice but to use the information that Ian and Margaret and Winston pulled together in their article on gasoline consumption, and I would probably use the very same studies on premature mortality. But one of the great things about being an analyst and about doing research is that when you see results like this that don't seem to comport with your common sense, then you've got a clear opportunity to try to do the study in a better way to see if you come up with a different finding. After all, that's scientific research. Now, for a lunchtime speaker, I've already gone on long enough, and some of you are glancing nervously at your watches now. So why don't I stop, and if there's a moment or two for questions, I would be happy to answer them. But again, and most importantly, my thanks to the Society of Risk Analysis and to Resources for the Future for giving me the privilege of coming back and talking to you all. Thank you very much. No questions about the Atkinson parameter, however.
You don't mind if I go, Paul? You work here. A little at the intuition. So Alan Krupnick. So I just think, just for the audience, Paul, I know you know this, but just for the audience on the intuition on the deaths from PM, remember what this is these are, since everybody dies, these are deaths that are brought forward by a little bit in time and over a large number of people. So the death rate in this country is 800 per 100,000. So you can do the math on what that translates to in a country with as many people as we have. So it's kind of easy to get up to those levels of deaths when you have a very big denominator and you have a fairly big source term. It's about either from 0.3 to 0.4% change in the mortality rate for a 1 microgram per cubic meter change in 2.5, an annual 2.5. An annual PM, to reduce annual PM is not easy. I mean, this isn't daily. This isn't just clipping peaks. This is annual. Mm-hmm. So I don't know. So my intuition, as Paul suggested, my intuition is a little bit different in this. That when I have it leavened by that sort of thinking.
Well, Alan, it's true that 12,000 is a small number compared to the 300 million population of the United States that I used to calculate this. And from a regulatory standpoint, those are premature deaths. Obviously, those are not people who are going to live forever. I sort of feature myself as being the only person to whom that will happen. But if each of those persons, 12,000 persons, dies 2 minutes early, then a fair question is, what's the monetary significance of that, and how much money are you willing to spend? My impression is that those cases get valued at $3 or $4 or $5 million, and hence the benefits of any regulatory action, including improving the composition of Kleenex that might slightly reduce the ambient concentration of fine particles, gets a very, very heavy hit in a benefit-cost analysis. And so I guess I could partially say, do we attach the same value to preventing the premature mortality of an 81-year-old who will live to 81 years in one day as we would to someone who dies prematurely at 45 who might live to the ripe old age of, say, 64, to use a number that's now particularly salient to me.
I love the comment on that, but there's a long line.
Hi, Brian Hubble. I'm with the Air Office, and so I do a lot with these calculations. And one thing I wanted to point out about this is that, in fact, intuition is often wrong on these things, and common sense is often wrong.
I'm shocked that you'd say that.
Yeah, I'm surprised. Well, given the example, in fact, Arden Pope actually told me one time that he didn't expect to find these things. This was an accident, and so he kept pounding on it. He's continuing pounding on it, and he keeps finding this effect no matter what he does. And so recently he did something which was really interesting, which is he said, well, let's look at this from the life expectancy standpoint. Let's see what we can do if we not look at death counts, but let's look at life expectancy. And guess what? Found the same thing. And in fact, he found it was a significant improvement in life expectancy for every microgram we've reduced at PM. So they have looked at that question. But the other thing I want to point out is that we don't stop just with the epidemiology. That's a really critical part of this, is it opens up an enormous amount of additional research. And originally people thought, well, it must be respiratory. People are breathing PM. It must be killing people because of respiratory. Well, it turns out once we did the additional work, both epidemiology and lab work and clinical work and toxicology, that actually the majority of it's coming from cardiovascular. And so there's a number of things that happen when you find things in epidemiology and when you do cost-benefit analysis, is that it opens up avenues of research. And I think that's really important. The other thing is that with the gas information and what climate impacts is you have to begin looking at the models and saying what's in and what's out of these models. Have they been adequately represented? You say, well, I'll use that because it's the best available. But in the case of climate, you have to look at
like my intuition, thinking that we're undervaluing the...
Yeah. The point is that the climate has not been adequately characterized. PM now really has been. And we feel like we can make very causal statements about PM.
Rick Belzer, Regulatory Checkbook.
And you think my intuition on particles is right, but it's wrong on CO2, right?
You picked two particular areas where you're uncomfortable. And there are others in here who know a lot more about this than I do. All I know is what I read in the paper. But it is my understanding that the kind of EPA's best available models for climate change would predict a couple part per billion drop in PM. And so there's a possibility that you have a medieval torture in front of you, that not only do you think that the benefit cost analysis is understating the benefits for climate change mitigation, and yet the models, best available models, seem to be suggesting that climate change would reduce PM slightly, but then every 1 part per billion is a lot of lives. Mm-hmm. Now what do you want to do?
Well, I'm a dean, so medieval torture, it would be simple for me. I mean, you know, we had this same thing when we were talking about reducing ambient ozone concentrations, and people suggested that might reduce the reflectivity and hence exacerbate global climate change. I don't think you have any question but to determine which of these things are valid hypotheses, test them, and then go with what you find. I don't think we have any choice but to do that. Somebody else has got to make the political call.
I'm Fran Sussman from ICF International, and I don't have an opinion on particulate matter at all. But I do have a question, and that's that I do agree with your judgment that we want to be able to use the best information we have available, as well as incorporate many of the ideas that we heard this morning on distributional concerns and other issues when we're making decisions, particularly EPA and other agencies. And I guess my question is, given the institutional constraints we have, the legal constraints we have, and other constraints we have on how decisions are made, many of which are sort of designed to prevent abuses or prevent capricious behavior or prevent intuitive behavior. How can we change the system, or how can we work within the system in order to use that best information and to incorporate considerations such as distributional analysis and other concerns that we feel should be part of the decision-making paradigm but are not easily incorporated at this time?
And I guess my answer is, and I don't mean this to sound as facile as it may seem, but you know, this town is filled with people whose purpose is to make sure that analysis gets done in conformance with laws and regulations, and if there's a requirement that small business considerations be taken into account, then there are people who want to make darn sure that OSHA or EPA or the Consumer Product Safety Commission or new regulatory agencies that may be created take small business effects into account. I mean, that's, in some ways, it's one of the frustrating things about Washington, but it's also one of the wonderful parts about it as well, is that there are plenty of people speaking up for those who they believe don't have an adequate voice, and they make sure that these things get taken into account or try to ensure that that's the case.
I'm Kerry Smith, and I've asked a few questions before, so never one to be quiet. I wanted to ask, well, what would it take to change your mind? And I mean that seriously on each of these questions. I think one of the things that we fail to do is we think about improving the line of research within the particular venue that led to the mortality effect or that led to our measures of the external costs of using more gasoline and so forth. But the question is, what side calculations on the mortality side or on the health effects, the stream of health effects and their implications, or what side effects on the gasoline case would convince you to have more confidence in those values?
Well, Kerry, that's a very good question, and I'm not sure I have a very good answer. I think about that, and like everybody else, I suppose, you know, maybe I have beliefs that are empirically unshakable, which is not a complimentary thing to say about oneself. I mean, I ask myself, well, could you ever be convinced that the mortality effects are this big? I'd like to think that, yes, if maybe, well, I was going to say something that would sound disparaging to someone else. Maybe an even more convincing study done more carefully with larger samples, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, you know, I'm a scientist, or have been until I became Deadwood administration. So, you know, I'd like to think that carefully done studies change my mind, and they have in the past. So, Maybe it's just a lack of faith or an insufficient accumulation of sufficiently convincing studies to sort of leave me confident that I can say what I do say, that is, fine particles are the problem, without hearing that nagging voice in the back of my head.
Samar Chatterjee from US EPA. Sir, since you're delivering a luncheon address, which is, of course, punctuated with humor, I'll play a little devil's advocate and ask you, and I hope I get a humorous answer. Now you said you've done a cost-benefit analysis of reducing America's dependence on imported oil. And so having done that, I'm sure you did it sometimes in the 70s, early 70s, when the first oil embargo was there. And from then, we've been doing that in this country all along. And whether you go to the politicians, and all of them proclaim that they want to be independent, they don't want to be governed by this oil dependence and so on. But we have continued to grow in dependence in a significant way. So I'm just wondering, and then the American diplomats and American oil companies go around, especially to Arab countries where those who have a lot of oil. By the way, I don't come from a country which has oil, which is India.
Neither do I.
No, that's a good one. But I think, but that's a wrong answer, though. I mean, since 1970s I've been in this country, and I've been always told that America is preserving its own oil and buying imported oil so that when everyone else runs out, and everyone else is insecure, they have no oil, then America will start drilling its own oil, coming up with it.
We'll all be using electric cars and plug-in hybrids, that's right.
So, given that, I'm just wondering, why are we, on one hand, we have all this rhetoric that we don't want to be dependent on oil, but we do everything possible to go to these countries and give them good deals and so on, so that the Russians don't come in and get that oil, or the Chinese don't come in. And now, of course, India is also thinking of going after that oil. We are doing everything to take that,
right,
import it, and create diplomatic relationship with those countries. So
okay.
Which one is the right way?
Well,
we want to be dependent, or we don't want to be dependent?
Well, that's the same kind of inconsistency that leads us to say, as we do now, we need to save more in the United States, just not yet, right? I mean, it's true that we say we're too dependent on foreign oil, and yet a long succession of presidents have gone to the Middle East and directed them, pled with them to increase oil output so that we could import more. And that's sort of on the political side, and I'm not qualified to speak to that. Why is it that I'm concerned about this now? This is not an issue that I studied in the 1970s. Maybe I've heard Jim Woolsey's talk about Wahhabi fundamentalism too many times now. I've kind of bought into this, but I'm just concerned about being so dependent on so many countries in sensitive parts of the world, or countries who don't have our best interests at heart. And I find myself a little apprehensive about assigning a value of 12 cents per gallon at a time when gasoline is $2.75 a gallon to that externality. But, consistency, thy name is not Paul. So, thank you again very much.